What if I told you the West didn't misunderstand Japan by accident, but because it has spent more than a century looking at the country through the wrong lens? For decades, Western leaders, economists, and journalists have tried to interpret Japan using familiar frameworks. Democracy versus authoritarianism, capitalism versus state control, tradition versus modernity. Every time Japan behaved in ways that didn't fit these categories, the West treated it as an anomaly, a puzzle that would eventually resolve itself into something more familiar. They predicted Japan's collapse more than once. They assumed its economic miracle was unsustainable. They believed Western-style individualism would naturally replace Japanese social structures as prosperity rose. They expected Japan to become slowly but surely a smaller version of the United States. And every single time, they were wrong. This wasn't just bad forecasting. It wasn't a lack of data or intelligence failures. The deeper problem was that the West kept using frameworks built to understand Europe and America and forcing Japan into boxes that never fit. The longer these misunderstandings persisted, the more distorted Western policy toward Japan became. This video explores why the West never truly understood Japan, how those misreadings shaped economic and political decisions, and why Japanese society continues to defy Western expectations. One of the most persistent myths is that Japan's post-war success was simply the natural result of adopting Western-style capitalism and democracy. The story often goes like this. The United States rebuilt Japan after World War II, introduced free markets and democratic institutions, and Japan flourished as a result. End of story. But this narrative misses what actually powered Japan's rise. Japan did not become wealthy by copying American laissez-faire capitalism. It built a tightly coordinated economic system where government ministries, banks, and corporations worked together in long-term planning. Industrial policy guided investment into strategic sectors. Companies prioritized stability, market share, and national competitiveness over short-term profit. Workers traded lifetime employment and loyalty for security and collective success. To Western economists, trained to believe markets should operate independently of the state, this looked inefficient, even dangerous. Many predicted Japan's system would eventually collapse under its own weight. Instead, Japan became the world's second-largest economy. The misunderstanding came from assuming that Western capitalism was the only path to prosperity. In reality, Japan had created something fundamentally different, a hybrid system rooted in its own history of centralized coordination, social obligation, and long-term thinking. Another myth centered on conformity and obedience. Western commentary often portrayed Japanese society as rigid, hierarchical, and resistant to change, a culture where individuals simply followed rules without question. Yet Japan's history tells a far more complex story. For centuries, Japanese society has balanced strict social roles with intense adaptability. During the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, Japan rapidly absorbed foreign technologies, institutions, and military methods while preserving its own cultural foundations. Where many societies collapsed under the pressure of modernization, Japan selectively adopted what it needed and reshaped it to fit Japanese values. This pattern repeated after World War II. Japan embraced modern industry, global trade, and technological innovation, but it did so in social structures that emphasize harmony, hierarchy, and collective responsibility. Western observers often mistook this for blind conformity. In reality, it was a different form of social organization designed to minimize conflict and maximize coordination in a densely populated island nation with limited resources. The West also misunderstood how Japanese people thought about stability and change. In many Western societies, progress is imagined as a straight line, constant disruption, individual reinvention, and rapid turnover. In Japan, change has historically been cyclical and controlled. Institutions evolve slowly. Reforms happen incrementally. Social cohesion is prioritized over radical transformation. This is why Japan's political system has appeared stagnant to Western eyes, with the same party dominating government for decades. Western analysts interpreted this as democratic failure or voter apathy. But within Japanese political culture, continuity is often seen as a strength. Stability allows long-term planning, social trust, and economic coordination. Sudden political swings are associated with chaos, not renewal. This doesn't mean Japan lacks dissent or debate. It means disagreement is managed within institutions rather than expressed through constant upheaval. The West's expectation that Japan would mirror Western political volatility missed this fundamental cultural preference for equilibrium. There is also a deeper historical memory shaping Japanese behavior that Western analysis frequently ignores. Japan's modern identity was forged under the threat of Western imperialism in the 19th century. The arrival of foreign gunboats forced Japan to modernize rapidly or risk colonization. This produced a national obsession with strength, technological advancement, and sovereignty. Economic development wasn't just about wealth. It was about survival. This mindset carried through the devastation of World War II and into the post-Yi rebuilding period. Japan's drive to become an industrial powerhouse was fueled by a collective determination to never again be at the mercy of foreign powers. When Western policymakers treated Japan purely as an economic partner or junior ally, they often failed to grasp how deeply this historical experience influenced Japanese strategy, trade policy, and technological ambition. Another major misunderstanding involved individualism. Western societies tend to prioritize personal freedom, self-expression, and individual achievement as the highest social values. Japanese culture places far greater emphasis on social harmony, duty, and belonging. This doesn't mean Japanese people lack individuality. It means identity is more strongly defined through relationships to family, company, community, and nation. When Western managers complained that Japanese workers lacked creativity or initiative, they were applying the wrong standard. Innovation in Japan often emerges through collective refinement rather than individual disruption. Teams iterate. Systems improve. Processes are perfected. This is why Japanese manufacturing became synonymous with quality and efficiency. The West expected genius inventors breaking rules. Japan produced disciplined excellence built over decades. These cultural differences repeatedly led Western analysts to misjudge Japan's trajectory. In the 1980s, when Japan's economy surged and Japanese companies dominated global markets, Western media swung from dismissing Japan to fearing it would overtake the United States. Books warned of a coming Japanese economic empire. Politicians spoke of unfair competition. Trade tensions exploded. Yet once again, the analysis relied on Western assumptions about endless growth, market behavior, and corporate priorities. When Japan's asset bubble burst in the early 1990s and growth slowed, many in the West declared Japan finished, a failed model destined for permanent stagnation. But Japan didn't collapse. It adjusted. Living standards remained high. Social stability held. Technological leadership continued in many fields. The country absorbed decades of slow growth without mass unrest or institutional breakdown. Western frameworks, built around boom and bust cycles and rapid reinvention, couldn't easily explain a society that prioritized resilience over speed. And so the misunderstanding continued. The West kept waiting for Japan to either fully become Western or to fail for refusing to do so. Neither happened. Japan remained distinctly Japanese, modern yet traditional, capitalist yet coordinated, democratic yet stability-focused. And the more Western observers tried to force Japan into familiar categories, the more reality refused to cooperate. Understanding Japan requires abandoning the assumption that all societies naturally evolve toward Western norms. It requires recognizing that history, culture, and social structure shape entirely different paths to modernity. Japan is not a delayed version of the West. It is a civilization that modernized on its own terms. And until Western analysis accepts that fundamental truth, Japan will continue to be misunderstood, not because it is mysterious, but because the wrong lens keeps being used to view it. To understand why Japan followed such a different path from Western nations, you have to look far deeper than post-war reforms or modern economic policies. The roots stretch back centuries into a society shaped by scarcity, hierarchy, and an intense awareness of collective survival. Japan is a mountainous island nation with limited arable land and few natural resources. For most of its history, survival depended on cooperation, discipline, and efficient use of what little was available. Communities that fractured under conflict or extreme individualism simply did not endure. Over time, this produced a culture where social harmony was not just a moral ideal but a practical necessity. While Western societies developed around vast territories, frontier expansion, and individual mobility, Japan developed around density, stability, and interdependence. Relationships were structured through obligation rather than contracts. Loyalty flowed upward, protection flowed downward, and social order was maintained through mutual responsibility. This system reached its most refined form during the Tokugawa period, when Japan closed itself off from much of the world for over 2 centuries. During this time, internal peace was maintained not through constant coercion, but through deeply ingrained social roles. Samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants all had defined places in the social structure. Identity was not something you reinvented. It was something you inherited and refined. Western observers often interpret this as oppression or lack of freedom. But within Japanese historical experience, this structure produced predictability, security, and long-term continuity. When Japan was forced open to the world in the 19th century, it faced a brutal reality. Societies that failed to modernize quickly were colonized. Entire civilizations were carved apart by foreign powers. Japan's leaders understood something critical that many others did not. Modernization was not about becoming Western. It was about acquiring Western tools while preserving Japanese cohesion. Factories, railroads, modern armies, centralized education, and industrial planning were adopted at astonishing speed. But the social fabric remained intact. Loyalty to emperor and state replaced loyalty to feudal lords. Collective sacrifice was reframed as national progress. This ability to absorb external systems without losing internal identity became one of Japan's defining strengths. Western analysts frequently missed this pattern. They assumed modernization naturally dissolved traditional structures. In Japan, modernization reinforced them. The same dynamic appeared again after World War II. The country lay in ruins, cities burned, industry destroyed, millions displaced. Yet instead of social fragmentation, Japan rebuilt through intense collective effort. Companies became surrogate families. Workers devoted themselves to corporate success not just for pay, but for shared identity and security. Managers took responsibility for employee welfare. Long-term employment became the norm. This was not free market capitalism as taught in Western textbooks. It was a social contract embedded inside economic institutions. When Western corporations chased quarterly profits, Japanese firms invested in decades-long growth. When Western workers changed jobs frequently, Japanese workers built careers within a single company. When Western markets rewarded speed, Japanese systems rewarded precision and reliability. These differences produced remarkable results. Japanese automobiles became global benchmarks for quality. Electronics companies dominated world markets. Manufacturing processes pioneered efficiency methods that Western firms later rushed to imitate. Yet Western economists continued to view Japan's system as unnatural, a distortion that would eventually break. They assumed workers would revolt against lifetime loyalty. They assumed corporations would collapse under long-term planning. They assumed government coordination would stifle innovation. But Japan's system endured for decades because it aligned with cultural expectations of stability, responsibility, and collective progress. Another layer of misunderstanding came from how Japan approaches conflict and decision-making. Western political culture often celebrates confrontation. Debate is public. Disagreement is visible. Power struggles are open. Japanese culture tends to avoid open conflict whenever possible. Disputes are resolved quietly. Consensus is built slowly. Public harmony is preserved even when private disagreements exist. To Western observers, this can look like passivity or lack of leadership. In reality, It reflects a different logic of social management. Decisions may take longer, but once consensus forms, execution is swift and coordinated. Institutions move together rather than against each other. Social trust allows large-scale cooperation without constant legal enforcement. This is why Japanese infrastructure projects, manufacturing chains, and disaster responses often operate with remarkable efficiency. But Western frameworks, built around adversarial politics and individual negotiation, struggle to recognize the power of consensus-based systems. The West also misunderstood Japan's relationship with risk. In highly individualistic societies, risk-taking is often rewarded. Entrepreneurs are encouraged to gamble on disruptive ideas. Failure is framed as learning. In Japan, risk is managed collectively. Stability is valued more than rapid breakthroughs. Systems are optimized to avoid catastrophic failure rather than chase explosive growth. This produced slower innovation in some sectors, but extraordinary reliability in others. Trains that run within seconds of schedule. Manufacturing defects measured in fractions of a percent. Supply chains designed to withstand shocks. When Western commentators criticized Japan for lacking Silicon Valley-style entrepreneurship, they were again applying the wrong metric. Japan was not designed to maximize disruption. It was designed to maximize resilience. This difference became especially visible during economic downturns. While Western recessions often brought mass layoffs, housing crises, and political instability, Japan absorbed long periods of slow growth with minimal social breakdown. Companies reduced hours instead of firing workers. Communities supported struggling families. Institutions prioritized social stability over financial shock therapy. To Western economists, this looked inefficient. To Japanese society, it looked responsible. The misunderstanding deepened as global narratives framed economic success purely through growth rates and stock markets. By those measures, Japan appeared stagnant after the 1990s, but by measures of life expectancy, safety, education, infrastructure, and social cohesion, Japan remained among the most successful societies in the world. Western analysis rarely reconciled these two realities. It continued waiting for collapse, and Japan continued functioning. These recurring misjudgments were not simply about economics. They reflected a deeper failure to grasp how history, culture, and collective memory shape behavior. Japan did not build its modern systems around individual ambition alone. It built them around shared survival, mutual obligation, and long-term continuity. Until Western frameworks recognize that modernity can take fundamentally different forms, Japan will continue to appear confusing, not because it is irrational, but because it is operating according to a different logic entirely. The moment that crystallized Western misunderstanding of Japan more than any other came at the end of the 1980s. Japan's economy was booming. Tokyo real estate prices reached absurd heights. Japanese corporations were buying iconic American assets. Media headlines warned that Japan would soon dominate the global economy. To many in the West, this looked like unstoppable ascent. Then the bubble burst. Asset prices collapsed. Growth slowed. Banks struggled under mountains of bad debt. For the next 2 decades, Japan experienced what became known as the lost years. Western analysts treated this as proof that Japan's economic model had finally failed. They framed it as inevitable collapse delayed by government intervention. They warned that Japan was trapped in stagnation, burned by inefficiency, unable to adapt. Yet once again, the deeper reality was far more complex. Japan did not respond to its financial crisis the way Western economies typically do. There was no mass social upheaval, no sudden dismantling of institutions, no shock therapy designed to purge the system at all costs. Instead, Japan prioritized stability. Banks were supported rather than allowed to implode. Companies were encouraged to restructure slowly. Workers were protected. Communities were shielded from severe disruption. From a Western economic perspective obsessed with rapid correction and creative destruction, this seemed like a mistake. But from Japan's perspective, avoiding social breakdown was more important than restoring growth at maximum speed. And it worked. Unemployment remained low. Crime stayed minimal. Life expectancy continued to rise. Infrastructure improved. Social trust held. Japan absorbed one of the largest financial collapses in modern history without tearing itself apart. Western frameworks rarely accounted for this outcome. They measured success through GDP growth curves and stock market recoveries, not through social cohesion or long-term stability. So Japan was labeled stagnant. But everyday life remained among the safest, healthiest, and most organized in the world. This disconnect reveals a core difference in what societies prioritize. In much of the West, economic systems are designed to maximize dynamism, risk-taking, and rapid innovation, even at the cost of volatility and inequality. In Japan, systems are designed to minimize failure cascades, protect communities, and preserve institutional continuity. One model favors speed. The other favors endurance. Western observers repeatedly judged Japan through the first lens. Japan continued operating through the second. The misunderstanding extended into demographics as well. As Japan's population aged and birth rates fell, Western media portrayed the country as facing inevitable decline. Headlines warned of shrinking workforces, collapsing pension systems, and economic paralysis. Yet Japan adapted in ways Western models did not predict. Automation increased productivity. Elderly participation in part-time work rose. Communities reorganized around care systems. Urban planning adjusted to aging populations. The challenges were real, but they did not produce societal breakdown. Once again, Western forecasts of imminent crisis failed to materialize. This pattern of misreading Japan stems from projecting Western historical experiences onto a society shaped by entirely different assumptions. Western countries industrialized alongside expanding populations, colonial resource extraction, and rapid geographic growth. Japan industrialized under constraints, limited land, limited resources, dense population, and constant vulnerability to external pressure. Efficiency, coordination, and long-term planning were not ideological preferences. They were survival strategies. This is why Japanese companies became masters of process improvement rather than explosive disruption. Why institutions evolved slowly rather than reinvented constantly. Why policy prioritized continuity over radical swings. Western economic theory, built largely around frontier expansion and abundant resources, struggles to account for societies optimized for scarcity and resilience. The result is persistent analytical blind spots. Another area of misunderstanding lies in Japan's relationship with technology. Western narratives often assume innovation requires loose regulation, individual experimentation, and chaotic competition. Japan pursued a different path. Government agencies coordinate research priorities. Corporations collaborated across industries. Universities aligned with national development goals. Rather than thousands of startups racing independently, Japan built innovation through networks. This approach powered breakthroughs in manufacturing robotics, precision engineering, electronics, and transportation systems. Yet because it didn't match Silicon Valley mythology, Western analysts frequently downplayed its effectiveness. They saw coordination as bureaucracy. They saw long-term planning as rigidity. They saw stability as stagnation. Meanwhile, Japanese firms quietly set global standards for quality and reliability. This difference in innovation philosophy mirrors the deeper cultural divide. Western systems reward disruption. Japanese systems reward refinement. Both produce progress. They simply follow different rhythms. The West also misunderstood how deeply collective memory shapes Japanese risk behavior. Natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, have repeatedly devastated the country throughout history. Entire cities have vanished overnight. Recovery has been a recurring national experience. This fostered a mindset oriented toward preparation, redundancy, and long-term resilience. Infrastructure is over-engineered. Emergency systems are rehearsed. Social cooperation in crises is expected. When catastrophe strikes, response is collective and organized rather than chaotic. Western societies, less accustomed to recurring large-scale disasters, often emphasize reactive solutions. Japan emphasizes prevention and endurance. These historical experiences reinforce the cultural preference for stability over short-term optimization. And once again, Western analytical models rarely integrate this context. They interpret Japan's cautious approach as lack of ambition. In reality, it is strategic patience shaped by centuries of vulnerability. Across economics, politics, technology, and social organization, the same pattern repeats. The West expects Japan to behave like a Western society at a different stage of development. Japan continues to behave like Japan, a civilization optimized for coordination, resilience, and long-term continuity. The failure to recognize this has fueled decades of incorrect predictions, collapse that never arrives, stagnation that still produces high quality of life, rigidity that quietly adapts. Each time reality diverges from theory, Western frameworks shift timelines rather than assumptions. Recovery is coming, just later. Reform is inevitable, just slower. The model isn't wrong. Japan is just unusual. But when a theory repeatedly fails to explain outcomes, the problem is rarely the society being studied. More often, it's the lens doing the studying. And Japan, like China, continues to expose how narrow many Western assumptions about development, progress, and modernity truly are. At its deepest level, the Western misunderstanding of Japan comes down to fundamentally different ideas about what makes a successful society. Western political and economic thought, shaped by the Enlightenment, places extraordinary emphasis on individual freedom, constant innovation, rapid growth, and disruptive change. Progress is imagined as something that happens through competition, conflict, and continual reinvention. Japanese society evolved around almost the opposite priorities: harmony over confrontation, continuity over upheaval, collective stability over individual disruption. Neither approach is inherently superior. They simply emerge from different historical pressures, geographies, and survival strategies. Where Western societies expanded across continents with abundant resources, Japan refined itself within narrow limits. Where Western economies could afford repeated cycles of boom and collapse, Japan learned to design systems that absorbed shocks quietly. Where Western cultures celebrated breaking away from tradition, Japan learned to modernize without dissolving its social fabric. The mistake Western analysts kept making was assuming that their own path to modernity was universal, that all societies would naturally converge toward the same political structures, economic behaviors, and cultural values once they reached a certain level of wealth and education. Japan never followed that script. It modernized while preserving hierarchy. It industrialized while reinforcing social obligation. It democratized while prioritizing stability over volatility. And every time it did so, Western frameworks struggled to explain what they were seeing. This is why Japan has repeatedly appeared contradictory through Western eyes. A high-tech society that values tradition. A capitalist economy coordinated by long-term planning. A democracy with remarkable political continuity. A slow-growth nation with extraordinary quality of life. These combinations feel strange only if one assumes there is a single correct formula for development. Once that assumption is removed, Japan becomes far easier to understand. It is not an incomplete version of the West. It is a complete system built around different priorities. The consequences of misunderstanding Japan have not just been academic. They have shaped trade conflicts, economic forecasts, corporate strategies, and diplomatic expectations. Western businesses entered Japan expecting American-style consumer behavior and market dynamics, only to struggle with relationship-based commerce and long-term partnerships. Western policymakers alternated between fearing Japanese dominance and dismissing Japanese decline, rarely grasping the country's capacity for steady adaptation. Economic models predicted outcomes that never materialized because they failed to account for culture as a structural force. And perhaps most importantly, the West repeatedly misjudged what motivates Japanese decision-making. Security over spectacle, resilience over rapid reward, coordination over chaos. These priorities are not signs of weakness. They are products of centuries of lived experience. Japan's history taught that society survived not by burning brightest, but by lasting longest. This is why the country rebuilt so quickly after catastrophe. Why it absorbed economic crisis without social collapse. Why it continues to function with remarkable order in a rapidly changing world. The Western tendency to measure success primarily through growth curves and disruption cycles misses this deeper form of strength: endurance, reliability, social cohesion. None of these fit neatly into quarterly reports or headline-driven narratives. Yet they are precisely what allowed Japan to remain one of the world's most stable and prosperous societies for over a century of extraordinary global change. The broader lesson extends far beyond Japan. When analysts assume that history flows toward a single destination, they inevitably misread civilizations that follow different trajectories. They mistake difference for dysfunction. They interpret alternative systems as temporary deviations rather than enduring structures. And they repeatedly predict transformations that never arrive. Japan's story shows that modernity is not a single road. There are many ways to build advanced societies. Some emphasize speed and disruption. Others emphasize coordination and continuity. Some prioritize individual expression. Others prioritize collective stability. All are shaped by history. All reflect survival strategies forged over centuries. Understanding Japan does not require agreeing with every aspect of its culture, politics, or economic system. It requires seeing it clearly on its own terms. Just as misunderstanding China leads to flawed policies and strategic surprises, misunderstanding Japan has repeatedly distorted Western expectations and decisions. The greatest danger is not that Japan follows a different path. The greatest danger is assuming it should follow ours. When societies are analyzed through inappropriate frameworks, leaders make choices based on fantasy rather than reality. Businesses invest based on incorrect assumptions. Public narratives swing between hype and despair. And each time reality refuses to match the prediction, the frameworks are adjusted slightly rather than questioned fundamentally. Japan is not slow to become Western. It is fast at becoming more fully itself. A modern society built on ancient principles of cooperation, resilience, and continuity. The real question is not why Japan never became like the West. The real question is why the West expected it to. Once that expectation is abandoned, Japan's history suddenly makes sense. Its economic strategies become logical. Its political stability becomes understandable. Its social priorities become coherent. What once appeared contradictory reveals itself as a different, but internally consistent system. And perhaps the most important insight is this: modern success does not require abandoning cultural foundations. In Japan's case, modernization worked precisely because it was built on them. The country did not survive by copying others. It survived by adapting the world to fit Japanese realities. Until Western analysis learns to take civilization, culture, and history as seriously as markets and institutions, misunderstandings like this will continue, not just with Japan, but with every society that refuses to follow a single simplified path to modernity. Understanding does not mean imitation. It means recognizing that different logics can produce different forms of success. Japan's rise, resilience, and stability are not anomalies. They are the outcome of a system working exactly as it was designed to work. The West never failed to understand Japan because the information was missing. It failed because it kept looking for a familiar story. And Japan was telling a different one all along.